Hey everyone, so today I'm doing a full lesson on how to cross-hatch an eye, and I'm breaking this up into chapters, so you'll be able to skip around if you want, because this is going to be a longer video since I wanted to show you exactly how I build up the form of an eye. So here, obviously I've sketched out the eye with graphite, and I'm using a Micron 005 pen, and that's important because the Micron 005 will give you actually the most control, where you can build up the form kind of slowly, as opposed to say like a Sharpie or even a Micron that's a larger pen size. So I really recommend trying the 005 for this because it will give you actually the most control. So all I've done so far is I'm using my pen just to go around and block out some of the areas that are kind of a midtone. And I'm looking at where are the grays, where are the blacks, like really deep values, and where are the lights and kind of everything in between. And I tend to skip around a bit when I do this. Some people will kind of try to go in all in one area, but I find that it's helpful to kind of move around a bit and sort of make sure that you're looking at the entire form as opposed to just, one area. You can kind of end up kind of missing the big picture a little bit. So that's kind of how I start. And you'll notice that I'm not making any really like hard edge marks. I'm going around, and what's going to make things the most realistic is when there's sort of a softness to it as opposed to really hard edge marks. So, you just kind of start by looking through, and I'm thinking a little bit about like the direction of line, which I've talked a lot about in some of the other videos, which I'll link to in the description. But you know, if you look at around the eye, for example, you see that the hatch marks are going kind of in the direction like radial around the eye. And then in maybe the crease of the eye, I'm thinking about how the crease goes from above the eye to the eyelid. And I'm trying to kind of like think of how the lines would help shape that or model that. So it's like you don't want to. I think that what sometimes happens is that when you're younger and you're drawing, when you think about a drawing, you end up filling it in, right, with color or something like that. But with this, what you're really actually doing is you're using pen to kind of model the form or shape the form. And so I think that that's kind of like a conceptual thing that you have to sort of rethink how you're approaching your drawing, as going from just coloring in or filling in an area to actually using your marks to shape the form. Now, one of the most important things to think about is building up a high contrast. And so you'll see that around like 17 minutes of this video, you start to kind of see the contrast. But right now you don't, obviously, because we're just kind of getting started with this drawing. But at the outset, what you want to do is look at the areas that have the most light, like the reflections, or the tear duct tends to have kind of like a bright spot on it, and make sure that you're blocking those out and not filling those in. So as you can kind of see in this drawing, in the iris, there's like a little area that I've kind of blocked out to make sure that I don't accidentally start drawing on top of that and lose that contrast. So you have to kind of plan ahead for the type of contrast that you're going to be able to see later on in the drawing. Another tip that I have for you is that you should just kind of like think of this as experimenting. In terms of how you make your lines, right? So I have another video recorded in another video where I talk about different ways to make marks. And with this, I'm mostly making, these kind of like little hatch marks, and then I'm going over them. The lines are not that long, as you can see here. And I'm just using a lot of layering to build up the form. But there's a lot of different variations even within that. Like you can see right now, actually, like I'm going faster, and so that changes the line. So your speed of the line will change, the type of mark that you have, how much control you kind of seem to have over it. If the lines are kind of more like jaggedy, if you look like in this current picture, like where you're seeing, you see that there's some lines that are kind of a little more like haphazard looking, and then others are a little bit more careful. So you have a lot of different things you can experiment with this type of drawing. Another tip that I have for this kind of drawing is to make sure that you have a lot of time. So it's a fun way to draw, and it's very satisfying in its own way, but it's not as immediate as, say, like charcoal or even graphite. And so I think that when people struggle with this, they kind of like underestimate maybe how much time this takes. So this entire drawing from start to finish took about 75 minutes. So just to give you a sense of the amount of time, and you know, you can obviously work on something like this in different sittings, but just make sure that you're not, you know, trying to do this too quickly, and then you might get kind of frustrated with what you're getting, and then sort of be like rushing it. So there's a significant amount of, you know, kind of like time spent that you have to put in to get the effects that you might want for this. As you can see here, I'm starting to build up a little bit more of a dark around the eye. And that's starting to give a little bit of more of a shape. So, you know, again, you know, going back to whatever image you're using, whether you're working from a mirror, you're working from a photograph, you know, you want to look at those darks and lights and midtones. So another tip that I have is that a lot of times when people are learning how to draw, they tend to kind of like generalize, which means that, you know, you're kind of imagining what you think an eye looks like, as opposed to really looking very carefully and closely at whatever your model is. So again, you could be working from a photograph, you could be working from a mirror. I don't recommend using a phone. Like, I know people do that, but if you can avoid that, that's great. But you want to be looking really closely at all of the details in the eye. And so that's going to be the thing that really will transform your drawing, is training yourself not only to look really closely, but to take what you're looking at and translate it into your drawing. And that, I think, is a lot of times one of the hardest things to do, because you can look really closely, and then when you go to actually draw, you're like, wait, you know, you could forget what you had just looked at, or you might have trouble translating it onto the page. So that's something just to practice. That's why people sometimes do those blind contour drawings, which you see where they have the kind of lines that go all over the place. The reason for that is that it's to train your eye and train your way of looking, so that you get better at looking at an object and then translating it by drawing it onto the page. As you can see right there, I just went around that, you know, that reflection spot, and it doesn't look so great now, but I'm laying down the groundwork that will help, you know, give it that contrast and make it look like a more kind of reflective surface. So the other nice thing about drawing an eye is you have so many different textures actually in your eye. You know, you've got, you know, the white of the eye and the iris, and the eyelid, and the you know, the area around it. And so I think this is a fun thing to practice, because you have so many different, you know, things you can kind of play around with, as opposed to just like, say, drawing a cylinder, drawing basic shapes. Those are good for practice, but they're, you know, they get kind of boring after a while doing that kind of thing. So, you know, an eye is kind of a fun thing it's a fun challenge, but it's also, you know, can give you pretty good results, because you have so much contrast in the eye between, you know, the darks and lights and everything in between. So I used a different pen for the pupil, just to show that that's really dark. It's significantly darker than any other area, except maybe the area around the iris. And so, but it's like too stark there. So I'm using the 005 to kind of go around it, and almost think of like that you're blending with the pen. Like, you can't blend obviously with pen, but by layering the lines, you can integrate it into the form and have it not be like quite so sudden and stark. So, you know, that's one tip in terms of just sort of like making sure that when you draw something that's really dark, you think about, well, what's the area around it, and does that need to also be shaded a certain way? You can see here, I'm starting to work a little bit on the eyelashes, and that will also give a little bit more definition to the eye. And again, I want you to look really closely at which directions the eyelashes are going in. This is another, you know, a tip similar to what I said earlier, which is that you don't want to be generalizing. So you want to look very closely at, you know, where in the eye are the eyelashes in relation to. So you want to look at, like, a lot of times people will just draw them all going in the same direction, but they actually don't quite do that. They come closer to the tear duct than that. So those are the kind of details that will help make your drawing more realistic. And of course, we talk about the white of the eye, but if you actually generally look at the white of the eye, it's not white. It has some midtone to it. And a lot of times, light will reflect off of the white of the eye. And so you can get some nice reflections in the white of the eye. But I want you to look at your white of your eye or whatever you're drawing and notice, is it actually as light as the reflection on the iris, or is it more in a midtone? So with what I'm drawing, it's more in a midtone. It's got some shadows in it, so I'm making sure to show that. Now, of course, everybody knows that there's like a top eyelid, but if you look closely at the eye, there's also a bottom, a bottom eyelid, but sort of like there's a little bit of space in between your eye and when your eyelashes, the bottom eyelashes start. So you want to like notice those kinds of details with whatever you're drawing. And this is where the idea of direction of line can come in handy. So if you notice, I'm using this sort of direction going around the white of the eye to give it a little bit more of a shape. And then on the bottom part, like below with the eyelid, I'm going in a different direction, which kind of helps show that there's like a different plane happening. So that can be another thing you might want to try. You'll notice the same idea here with the idea of line direction, where I'm going around in sort of this radial direction around the pupil. Again, integrating it into that dark area into the eye more, and also thinking about the line direction. So that's helping to build up more contrast as I do that too. And this is the kind of thing where as you do more, it will make other areas look more defined. So even by doing these eyelashes, like I feel like it's all relational to the whole eye. So it starts to give it a lot more dimension, even by putting in a detail like the eyelashes here. And notice too, when I'm doing the eyelashes, I'm using a really different type of line and pressure. So like it's more wispy, but it's layered. And I'm kind of like going quickly over it as opposed to these sort of like short marks that I was using for most of the other parts of the eye. So you can kind of step back from the drawing and see that, there's some stuff done. Like I've done I'm modeling a little bit more in the white of the eye, which is starting to help it shape up a little bit more. Again, everything is in relation to everything else. So by darkening up the white of the eye, it makes that reflection pop a bit more. And then by having that dark area around with the eyelashes, that also makes that light area with the reflection even more, noticeable. So it's these kinds of details that will help. It's not just having the white reflection, but you have to think about what's around it and using those relationships to give more contrast. And the idea of contrast is really just having very opposite, lights and darks. You can also have color contrast, of course, too. You can have different types of contrast, but in this, it's value contrast, right? So you're having your darkest darks next to your lightest lights, and that's going to make a stronger appearance where it's going to make the dark look darker and the light look lighter. So that's one of your most powerful things that you can do in a drawing like this, because that's what's going to give it, the sense of being three-dimensional and the sense of being reflective, and all the things that you're going for in this sort of drawing, you're going to be achieving, primarily through having significant contrast as you keep going through your drawing. So when people struggle with this, a lot of times what they're struggling with is that they're just not building up quite enough contrast. So I really recommend, if you can get make a little chart of values going from dark to light in a gradation, that can help. You can actually put that next to your drawing and say, oh wait, did I get that deepest value? And you can do this whether you're using graphite or charcoal or pen. It really doesn't matter the medium. You want to be looking at that contrast and using that idea of the contrast and the gradation from dark to light, with all those midtones in between, to help you understand this idea of contrast and to build it up more in your drawing. Okay, so I did a little bit more with the white of the eye, and now I'm starting to work on the area around the eyelid, because you don't want to forget about that area too. That's going to give the entire eye a lot more form. And so there's a lot of detail both above the eyelid, around the eye, and below the eyelid. And of course here, I haven't done the lower eyelashes yet, so I'm just going through and thinking about like sort of modeling the lower eyelid area, because I don't want to do the eyelashes first and then have to worry about the tone of the form around the eye, because then I'm going to be like doing the wrong thing first. So what you first want to do is think about kind of like the structure of the eye before you add the details like the bottom eyelashes. So again, like observe the area below your eyelid and notice that it's actually kind of light, right? So like you have this sort of area that's below that we usually don't think about, but it's going to actually be what gives you, you know, some good details here to observe those kind of details. So I would say that this is kind of like the second stage of your drawing, is that you have everything down now, but you want to do some more layering to get everything looking a little bit more finished. And the way that contrast and value works is that when you have darker values, they recede, right? So if you look at the crease around the eyelid, that makes it look like it recedes because there's a fold there. Whereas when you have lighter areas, they kind of pop forward with the way that you visually, with the way that your eye interprets them when you're seeing. So you want to use those kinds of things to help your drawing. So it's like if there's an area that recedes back into space, like in the crevice of the eye, you're going to have that be darker. And if there's an area that you kind of want to think of it like popping forward a little bit more, then that might be lighter. Of course, there's other situations where it's just light because there's a reflection, and just showing the reflection like on the iris, that's important. So here I actually noticed that there's a reflection of the eyelashes on the iris, and it actually goes into where that white reflection is. And so those kind of details are going to really take your drawing to the next level. So look at whatever you're looking at, whether again, it's a photograph or you're sitting in a mirror, I want you to look at the reflection and like, what's the actual shape of that reflection? Like, is it a big circle? Is it more of like a square or a rectangle type shape? Are there irregularities to the reflection? Those kind of details and that kind of level of observation is really going to help you improve your drawing. So even that, like what I just did there, I think gives it a little bit more of a glassy look. So spend some time layering those lines and then go back and add some of the details like the eyelashes, like what I'm doing right now. Look carefully at the eyelashes. Like, are they parallel to each other? Are they a little bit irregular? What's the shape? Make sure that you're getting all those kind of details down. And now I'm going back in and I'm deepening the values that are in the white of the eye, because again, there's actually a lot of shadow in the white of the eye. And so the more that you show the shadow and have some contrast of some lights there, it's going to look more realistic. You can go back over a lot of your lines to make, to deepen the values, which is what I'm doing here. So when you think about contrast, remember, it's all relationships, right? So it only looks dark because what's next to it is light. If it's just dark by itself, it doesn't really show the contrast. So contrast works because of the relationships between dark and light and midtones. So now here I'm modeling that underneath area for the eye. And again, I'm thinking about the direction of line, right? Because I want to think about this idea that it's going around and not, it's not like a flat plane. So using the line to try to show that shape, the flow of the line, like that can be really helpful. So again, if you look through the whole drawing, I'm trying to be mindful about how I'm using the direction of line to convey the form accurately. A lot of times also when people draw an eye, they start by trying to make like kind of a perfect almond shape. And that's sort of like generalizing the shape of the eye. So I want you to look really closely at the shape, and you can still, because you're using pen, you can make some adjustments as you're going. Now in this section, I'm going back and I'm shaping the whole area around the eye. So I don't have enough space to draw like my eyebrow here, but I definitely want to show the shape all around the eye in addition to just the eye itself. I also definitely recommend doing this in different sittings. I think that since this requires a lot of time and patience, giving yourself the time for sure, but also don't get to the point where you're kind of like tired of it and you're going to start making sort of like rushing and not being very deliberate in how you're marking. And if you look at all the marks that I've made all the way around the eye, notice that they kind of go in almost like a big oval around the eye. Like they're going in a direction that's deliberate. So think about, again, the direction. I know I'm kind of broken record on this in this video, but the direction of line and that layering is really going to help. Here I'm just deepening the values that are around that eyelid, and that also shows like the curvature of that plane, and it deepens the value, which makes it look like it recedes a little bit more, and that's very helpful for showing the depth. So a question often is how sharp do you want lines to be, right? So if you notice that crevice around the eyelid is actually kind of soft, but it's kind of like one of those things that you don't want it to be too soft and not look like it's defined enough, but you also don't want it to be so harsh that it looks like not realistic and too sharp. So it's kind of like a balancing act a little bit between how defined those lines are when you have like a line like that that's actually around your eyelid, and you want to convey that there's, you know, a change in the direction of those planes from like your eyelid to the top of your eye. So you might want to just experiment with that a little bit, but just be mindful of, you know, how sharp do you want that line to look like? If it's too sharp, it's going to be a problem. If it's too soft, it might not look defined enough. And so here I noticed that the area below the eye is not white. So I wanted to make sure that that's also in a midtone. So you have that like structure of like, you've got the eye and then you've got that lower area, and then you start to model your eyelid, your lower eyelid. And again, at this point, it's really just a lot of finishing details, you know, in terms of making the white of the eye a little bit darker, the eyelids a little bit darker, giving a little bit more tone and value around the eye. And then maybe going back over the eyelashes, because as you were doing the eyelid, sometimes that kind of gets a little bit lost and you have to redefine it a little bit. Or you notice more detail as you're going and you want to make sure that you're incorporating all those kinds of details. So like depending on whatever you're working from, you can actually sometimes see like, you know, that the eyelash actually goes into a follicle. And if you can show that, you know, that kind of level of detail, you know, you'll have even more of a sense of it looking really 3D. Make sure your eyelashes go far enough, but not too far. So you want to look at, you know, the relationship between the eyelash and the eyelid. And is the eyelash going far past the eyelid, or is it shorter than that? So those are the kind of things that I want you to start observing when you're drawing. And, you know, that will help both train your eye to be, you know, mindful of looking and not generalizing. And it'll also help your drawing. So now I'm working on the lower eyelashes, as you can see. And again, I'm going to that like sort of wispy, quicker line quality, but I have to layer a lot to make it dark enough. So as you can see, I'm working on that area. So when you're drawing, I think it's really important also just to look at this as practice and process and enjoy it, and not, you know, get too hung up on the results. So try to take these tips and techniques to heart, but, you know, don't feel like it takes a lot of practice to develop these kinds of skills. And as you're going, like everything that you do will help you. So even if you're just, you know, cross-hatching a sphere, like that practice alone is extremely helpful for improving your drawing skills. So I recommend, you know, always work with the basics, but also just try to have fun with it. If you found this helpful, if you don't mind subscribing, I'd really appreciate it, because apparently this is the only way to get it so that it gets out there to other people. So if you found these tips helpful, you know, go ahead, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave a comment if you feel like it. I really appreciate that so much. Also, if there was anything that came up throughout the course of this video that you were curious about, or you want to ask a question, you know, feel free to put that in the comments as well. So now I'm just finishing up with those final little details, like I'm making more wispy lower eyelashes, and I'm just going through and layering other areas just to kind of make things pop a little bit more. So this is the fun part where, you know, things kind of all are in place, but you get to kind of go and work on some of those little details that will make it look even better.